Thank you so much to Professor Welton, who's here with us today as part of our series for LGBTQ+ History Month. So Professor Welton is a professor of sustainable chemistry at Imperial College London. He served as the head of Department of Chemistry from 2007 to 2014, and then later as the Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences up until 2019. He is now the president of the Royal Society of Chemistry, and he also was awarded an OBE in 2017 for his services to diversity in education. So thank you so much for being here, and congratulations on being elected as the president for the Royal Society of Chemistry. What are some of your aims for your tenure?
So thank you very much, and you know, it was a delight to be elected, and you know, one of the things that I think is hugely positive, and I'm very proud of the chemical sciences community for, was, you know, they elected an openly gay man and didn't bat an eyelid. You know, it was just, you know, fantastic. And you know, and also there's a reality, which is, you know, when I started my career, I went to university in 1982. That would be unimaginable then. Whereas now it's kind of like, oh, well, that's no big deal, is it? And so that's amazing. Now, as for things that I want to do, so, I mean, surely, and of particular interest in this month, of course, is the RSC has been working on diversity and improving diversity in the chemical sciences through improving inclusion in the chemical sciences for, you know, quite some time. Hang on, I now need to count back. 1, 2, 3, 4 presidents ago. So Leslie Yellowlees really started all of this work during her presidency and brought inclusion and diversity to the fore. And so there's an ongoing program around this, which will continue way past my tenure as president. And of course, you know, feeding that particular theme is important to me. And sort of, you know, it's one of the advantages of being, you see, you can't be from a diverse background. You know, you're from the background you're from. You know, diversity is about communities of people, not individuals, but being from a recognized diverse background, you know, you keep that to the fore just by turning up. And yeah, and so that absolutely is important to me. The other thing which is important to me fits in with that job title, and that's sustainability. And I think it, you know, it really is so important now for us to constantly be addressing issues around sustainability with chemistry. And that's, so I presume you're aware of the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. They cover all sorts of different things, from, you know, diversity, gender equality, through to, you know, ending poverty, providing food. And very often I hear chemistry talked about, well, not even in one of those Sustainable Development Goals, number 12, it's 12.4, which is about pollution. Now, of course, pollution is important, and reduction of pollution is very important. But actually, all that focusing on 12.4 does is make you think about chemistry in terms of the potential harm that it can do to the environment and mitigating that harm. That is an important thing. However, chemistry can contribute to all of the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, the end in poverty, the providing food, the sustainable cities, but also the equality and social justice Sustainable Development Goals as well. And so I think we have to think much more positively about the contribution that chemistry can make to achieving all of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that will be, you know, the grand theme, if you like, of my presidency.
That's really interesting to hear. I think I've been guilty of doing that myself, like thinking quite linearly about chemistry. And so kind of going back to, I guess, the start of your career, how did you decide that you wanted to pursue chemistry? Did you like always know that you wanted to study science, or was it something that came later on in your life?
No, so there was a kind of succession. You know, so when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a pilot and join the RAF. And then, of course, as I got older and became a teenager, and I discovered that that might involve killing people, I wasn't quite so keen on it anymore. But I loved aeroplanes, and I thought, okay, so if I don't want to fly them, what I can do is design them. And so I kind of thought that I would be interested in becoming an aeronautical engineer of some kind. And, you know, and even when I was, 16, I remember I went to see one of the managers at Rolls-Royce, who had a plant relatively near where I lived, to talk about it. But then I started my A-levels, and with maths, physics, chemistry, very, straightforward for someone who was thinking of doing a kind of engineering future. And we did atomic structure in chemistry. And I just immediately went, this is amazing. I want to know more about this. And so that's the point at which, I decided, so I was already doing an A-level in chemistry, but the point at which I decided I wanted to study chemistry further was that. It was that caught me, the idea of how atoms are structured and how they come together to make molecules. I just found fascinating, and I haven't stopped since.
And why did you decide to pursue, chemistry down the strand of sustainable chemistry? What kind of factors influenced that?
Well, again, so that was an evolution. So I was, in the 1980s, I was aware of environmental issues. I was aware that chemistry, that 12.4 thing, I was aware then that, that chemistry had the potential to do great harm as well as great good, and was kind of broadly interested in trying to minimize that, but not particularly with a focus on or an understanding of how my research could fit in with that. Well, at first I wasn't doing research, I was an undergraduate. And then I started working on ionic liquids as part of my PhD, and as potential new solvents, they offered the potential to perhaps deal with some of the issues regarding the negative impacts of solvents. And so I kind of slowly started thinking more and more of that. And by the time I got to, I'd done my postdoc, was a lecturer, senior, et cetera, and becoming a professor of chemistry. So for me personally, but also out in the wider chemical world, the idea of green chemistry had been developing. And, and I very nearly called myself Professor of Green Chemistry, but also the idea of sustainability was developing. And there was just a little bit of a kind of, oh, hang on, I think this more accurately reflects what I am thinking than calling myself a green chemist, capital G, capital C.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And you mentioned briefly that you're researching in solvent chemistry. Could you describe a bit what research you're currently working on at the moment?
Okay, so I, still work with ionic liquids. They're still my favorite thing. And I have two aspects of my work. So I've always had, if you like, the fundamental chemistry aspect of my work and the applied chemistry aspect of my work. And, they fluctuate over the years, but roughly it's about half and half. And at the moment, my interest in always my interest in fundamental chemistry of ionic liquids has revolved around a really quite simple thing. They're ionic, they have cations and they have anions, therefore they have two species rather than a molecule which just has one species. And understanding the interplay of those two species and what happens if you change one, what happens if you change the other, how do they interact with each other, how does one reflect or generate qualities of the other, you know, that is always the fundamental question. And at the moment, we're particularly interested in viewing that around the mobility of ions and how ions move in within the ionic liquids, and particularly how that gets influenced by the application of an external electric field. So that's the, you know, lots of detailed physical chemistry kind of work. On the applied side at the moment, my primary interests are in the preparation and processing of polymeric materials from biomass, so cellulose, lignin, those kinds of things, and can we make them into useful and more sustainable alternatives to commonplace plastics. But also there's another part of my applied work, which is looking how a particular group of ionic liquids might be useful to be, for want of a better word, carriers for vaccines, and so delivery agents for vaccines, not the vaccine itself, but the other stuff that goes in the pot to enable it to be delivered to a person.
That's really, really interesting, and definitely like made me consider ionic liquids like completely differently. So what would you say is like the favorite part of your job? Yeah.
Oh, working with students. You know, very, very simply. Whether it's working with my research students in order to, you know, support them in doing their research. You know, I'm a PhD. There are different types of PhD, so people do it in different kinds of ways. I'm not a very instructional PhD supervisor. I don't do, you know, this week I want you to do X, Y, and Z experiments, and next week show me the results. I don't find that terribly interesting. But what I find interesting is discussing with someone what the possibilities are and helping them come to the decision of what things they're going to choose to focus on to answer the questions that we've been talking about. I love doing that. You know, it's a very high technical level, but I equally well enjoy, you know, being in a first year synthesis laboratory and showing somebody how to flute a filter paper, you know, and how to do the most basic of operations. And I like you know, I like seeing people discovering that they can do it and they can do things much more easily than they thought. And I quite like talking to people. So, you know, that more social side, the thing that we haven't had this year of literally wandering around a room full of students who are, you know, performing some task and chatting to them and saying, you know, at one hand, oh, what are you trying to do here? You know, how's it going? What can I do to help? But also just sort of saying, you know, who are you? Where are you from? You know, tell me a little bit about yourself.
And I guess kind of going to the opposite side of that question, what would you say have been like some of the hardest setbacks you've overcome working in science?
Oh, you know, thinking about that, you know, so, you know, it sounds trite to say, but, you know, every setback in your science is a piece of information that tells you that you didn't quite understand the system that you're looking at properly, and you need to view it differently. And if you view it differently, you will then be able to make, you know, technical scientific advances. So I would say every setback, in fact, is the start of something else. And there are countless hypotheses that I've had over the years which fell by the wayside pretty quickly, and actually many of them I've completely forgotten because they become irrelevant and you move on to the next stuff. So in that sense, I think you have setbacks every week, and that's how you progress in science. You know, in any kind of big way, major setbacks are, you know, we all have to learn the feeling of being rejected, you know. And so I applied for, in the year, just not totally. But in the year that I actually got my job at Imperial College, I applied for 12 jobs and didn't get 11 of them, you know. And so, you know, so that kind of rejection, you know, you just have to learn to deal with it, you know, take every rejection as a way of thinking, how can I improve this? If, you know, if I didn't make it this time, what is it I need to improve? One of the things I talk to people a lot about now is, you know, applying for jobs and those kinds of things. And, you know, someone will say to me, oh, I've got through to 6 interviews and I didn't get any jobs. And so I'm working on my CV to make it better. And I'll just say, there's nothing wrong with your CV. Your CV got you the interview. So your CV is fine. What you have to think about is what you did and said at the interview. You know, and using those knockbacks as opportunities of seeing what you should improve, how you should improve it, and getting yourself to the next stage. But, you know, that and, you know, research proposals that have been rejected, you know, rejection is the only people I know. My best friend is an actor. And the only people I know who have to learn to deal with rejection more than scientists is actors.
Yeah, I think rejection is definitely difficult and something that like a lot of the students are dealing with now as university results come out. So that's like some very useful advice. But I was wondering, you briefly mentioned before how LGBTQ plus issues were very different at when you started working with science, I guess, to how they are now. Would you be able to describe how, I guess, the issues have changed throughout your time?
So I'll just say it in this way. So for those of you who are in the UK, you might have recently seen It's a Sin on the television. And, you know, I have to say that is a very accurate depiction of what it was like to be young and it was mostly gay men in there, but young and LGBT plus in the early 1980s. And in the external world was, you know, vicious, absolutely vicious. And we were under attack in socially, and, you know, I remember there was a commissioner or something of the not commissioner, the head of Manchester Police saying that we were swirling in a cesspit of our own making. You know, to be abused on the street was commonplace. You know, I had friends that lost jobs because they were discovered to be gay. You know, it just government bringing in legislation to ban talking about being gay in schools, and all against the, you know, the backdrop of the HIV/AIDS epidemic as well, which we were dealing with. And so, yeah, it made the external world felt very, very hostile. Having said that, the scientific world, I have to say, my experience of the scientific world is that it's always been very, very well. I've always been out. You know, I came out as an undergraduate, so, you know, in any professional sense, I've always been out. And also, I would say is nobody's ever been surprised. So, you know, the vast majority of people have always known, and within 5 minutes of talking to me, I mean, listen to my voice, for God's sake. And I found the scientific world extremely welcoming, and always have. And, you know, particularly when I saw the juxtaposition of what my friends who weren't in science were experiencing, and then what I was experiencing in science, the gulf was huge, absolutely huge. And so, you know, what's changed is, you know, science, you know, maybe there have been changes, maybe there haven't been changes in science, but there probably didn't need to be as many changes in science. The external world has changed dramatically. You know, things are now illegal that were commonplace then. And, you know, you said that I got an OBE for diversity in education. So back then in 1982, 1983, 1985, and I'm remembering an incident in 1985. And, my views on diversity have not changed since then. In 1985, I can remember walking down the street with my friend Jane, and there was this concept that was being bandied around in the press. It was part of the attack on us, but also part on the attack on other people as well, called the loony left. And the idea was that your views were so ridiculous and extreme that they were loony. Think about the reference to mental ill health within that, just appalling idea, but the loony left. And I can remember walking along the street with my friend Jane and saying, I don't understand. I keep reading about this thing called the loony left, and I know what they're trying to do, but I've never met one. And she stopped, and she turned to me and she just said, "It's us, you idiot." And those views that I held in 1985, which are the same views that I hold now. In 1985, you were vilified as the loony left. Now you get an OBE. For holding exactly the same views. And so there's been a huge change. That's not saying that there isn't still improvement to be made, but there has been a huge change.
And so I guess, looking at the current situation now, in your opinion, what do you think kind of needs to be done to improve the visibility of LGBTQ+ people in STEM, but also in other fields?
So I think everywhere. So I'm a great believer in outness, and how did we get from where we were then to where we are now? And I think more than anything, of course, there were campaigning bodies, and I was part of that, and there's a point in my life where I think that I spent more of my time on demonstrations than I did doing anything else. But how do I think the change actually came about? The change actually came about by thousands and indeed millions of individuals deciding to live their lives openly and with dignity. And you went from a world where the vast majority of people believed that they didn't know anybody who was LGBT+, when in fact they did, to realizing that, oh, that nice person up the street who collects my mail for me when I'm out is LGBT+. And that person at work is, and slowly but surely the drip, drip, drip of the truth that, we are perfectly ordinary human beings who deserve all of the respect that other people do, just drops into place as they realize we're not the monsters of the cartoons that were drawn in 1982. We are that nice person that lives up the street. And so I would absolutely say that more than anything else, the outness is the tool. And the Royal Society of Chemistry, together with the Institute of Physics and the Royal Astronomical Society, did a report on being LGBT in the physical sciences a couple of years ago now. And it looked across the whole of being LGBT+, and there were differences depending on which part of the community you identify with. But the one thing that was constant all the way through, no matter which identity was being discussed, was that those people who were out were happier than those people who were not. And the reason in gay liberation back in the 1970s that they talked about the first step of gay liberation is coming out is because it is a liberation to come out and to be the other side of all that fear and worry and having that behind you and being able to live your life openly and with dignity is liberating, but also it is the thing that demonstrates to people who are not LGBT+ that we are dignified.
And what would you say, I guess, would be your biggest advice to anybody who is a student and is LGBT plus?
Well, I've just given it. And so, yes, absolutely be out. Be confident and be happy with yourself. So one of the things I have to say is, I often see things, I read something perhaps in the bio for somebody who is maybe doing something like this. And, and they will say, oh, I grew up doing it and struggling with my sexuality at the same time. And I just kind of go, I've never struggled with my sexuality. From the moment that I realized there was a period when I was thinking, I don't understand what it is. But once I got to the point where I understood what it was, I've not struggled with it. Don't struggle with it. It's perfectly fine. And that's the starting point. Inside, come out to yourself as somebody who respects and loves yourself. And then that enables you to have the confidence to come out to the wider world. And that's absolutely the best advice I can give.
And I think that's really applicable advice to anybody, whether you are LGBT plus or not, I think. Just happy with confident with yourself is.
What is it that RuPaul says? If you can't love yourself, how can you expect to love someone else? Yeah.
Really applicable to everybody. Yeah. And I guess, on the subject of advice with the current COVID-19 situation, what advice would you give to students who are, perhaps starting out at university or at any stage and are struggling, I guess, a bit with their studies at the moment?
Do you know what? I do feel sorry for, let me start with, I do feel sorry for you. It is tough. And, piece of advice number one is, this is not going to go on forever. This too shall end. And, and in terms of advice, keep at it. Do everything you can to connect with people. Even if it is through Zoom. I know Zoom is not as good as a real life interaction, but if it's the best you've got, do it. If the best you've got is, standing across the street from your neighbor and waving, stand across the street and wave at them, because those kind of personal connections will help. But then in another way, I would say, there are many moments, people doing A-levels who are saying, oh, this is really, COVID is making this really stressful. I'll tell you, if COVID wasn't here, you'd be stressed over your A-levels as well. And the key thing is, you're not being judged against people who took their A-levels 2 years before, or people who will be taking their A-levels too. You'll be judged against people who are taking their A-levels in the same circumstances as you. And, so do think about, those kind of things to help calm yourself down. Yes, it is a very difficult, going to university and not being able to, socialize and, play kiss chase in your hall of residence, for God's sake. It's not the full deal. But on the other hand, it's the deal you've got, make the best out of it. Although I suppose even that, one day the virtual reality world will get good enough that you don't, but at the moment it's not. And the stuff that I mentioned earlier on of actually the social contact of university life, the fact that you are talking to a professor, it doesn't matter that you're talking about the weather or the football or there's some element of it that just the community of scholars is easier to maintain when you're really with each other. And I think for when I look across the whole of the country and different subjects, I would say that's the thing that people have struggled with the most, is how do you maintain a feeling of community when you're not meeting in real life?
Yeah, I think that's definitely been a struggle, and hopefully going back soon will help with that. And one last question to finish off, which is a bit of a fun one, is who is your greatest role model?
My greatest, oh God, there's a list. you know, my parents were remarkable people, both of them. Well, my mum's still alive, but they didn't come from this kind of background. My dad was a postman builder, and my mum a cleaner. But the way in which they loved and supported me and my brother into being able to do whatever we wanted was, that's an amazing role model. More recently and more academically. So people like when I was at the University of Exeter, I had a boss there, Ed Abel, from whom I learned a huge amount of about how you lead groups of researchers. People like Julia Higgins, who, just an amazing. She is. She's an FRS, and a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. She's a dame. She's all of that kind of academic stuff. But also she is just, an amazing person who is so supportive of others, and will, to the extent at which I genuinely believe she will put others in front of herself. And so people like that. So there's a long list of them. Leslie Yellerlees that I mentioned before, who I quite liked the idea of being president of the RSC for a long time. But when I saw Leslie be president of the RSC, I just kind of went, I want to do that, and I want to do that soon. So that's I have literally followed in her footsteps, and so what an amazing role model.
Yeah, thank you so much once again for coming and chatting to us. I've learnt an incredible amount from you, and just being able to listen to your responses. And I'm sure everybody else has also. So thank you again.